This is understanding and implementing Apple School Manager for use with Apple Classroom. I imagine a lot of you guys are K-12, if not all of you. Is anybody in here not K-12? Okay, just a couple of you are not K-12. This may or may not be super relevant to you if you're not K-12, because this is primarily going to deal with setting up Apple School Manager to be used with class rostering to be used in classrooms that are K-12 classrooms. College students are theoretically adults, so you typically you're not going to need these kind of tools with them. So this is me. I'm Michelle Delaney. I'm a senior network engineer at Lexington County School District 1 in Lexington, South Carolina. I've been in K-12 for 10 years. This is my third school district. Let's see. I am Apple certified. I am also AirWatch certified, or AirWatch accredited, excuse me. I was an AD admin before I was a MacAdmin, so I'm familiar with Windows and Mac. And I'm really easy to get in touch with. So if you ever want to talk to me, Google Hangouts is typically the best way to get in touch with me because I'll actually answer you if I'm in a meeting. So if you ever need to get in touch with me, please just shoot me a Hangouts chat. I'm more than happy to answer. I like answering questions. It's one of my favorite things. If you couldn't tell, if you guys were at the question and answer thing yesterday, I find that type of thing fun. So we've got three main sections. We've got what is Apple School Manager? We've got how do I get it to work? And then we've got a way to get it into your classroom being used by your teachers. So we're going to go into the first thing. Okay, what is this thing? Apple School Manager is basically the evolution of the deploy.apple.com programs, all condensed into one little pane of glass. It's a little prettier than deploy.apple.com. It includes VPP, managed Apple IDs, and DEP. So all of that stuff is going to be consolidated into one pane of glass for you. If you listened to Apple several years ago and made all separate accounts for these three things, you're going to want to use the one that you used for your DEP account to upgrade into Apple School Manager and import the rest of them into that. So DEP, I'm going to operate under the assumption that all of you guys are familiar with what DEP is. Is there anybody in here that's not familiar with DEP? Okay. VPP is volume purchase. You've got your app purchasing in here. This is how you get all your apps out to your student devices and your teacher devices. Managed Apple IDs are the new thing that comes with Apple School Manager. They are basically iCloud storage and placeholders. They do not serve any purpose for downloading apps because they can't access the App Store. They can open it, but they can't download anything. So they are useful for storage and useful for children under the age of 13, but they don't have a whole lot of functionality associated with them. So why do you need it? You have to have it if you want to auto roster all of your Apple Classroom stuff. It's basically the reason why you need this, is if you don't want to roster all of your classes by hand, and personally I don't, because I have 25,000 students. I have zero desire to do manual class rostering. That sounds terrible to me. It would be very time consuming and very unpleasant. So I use Apple School Manager to do all of my rostering. So as I said before, managed Apple IDs can't purchase apps. You'll have lots of children going, I want my games, and they can't have them because they can't get to the App Store. It's honestly easier to just hide the App Store app from them so that they don't even look at it and so that they don't covet things they can't have, because sixth graders. So why? I'm sure since most of you are K-12 and or higher ed, you know what COPA is. So COPA is our lovely government restrictions on internet accounts for kids under the age of 13. They have to have things like parental consent, which if anybody who did Apple's U13 that existed before this? Fun, wasn't it? You had to get parental consent for every single Apple ID that was created for Apple U13. And that involved either them having an email address, or if you yammered at Apple hard enough, they gave you paper. So the problem with that, and the reason why they moved to these managed Apple IDs, was because U13 was problematic for a number of reasons. First reason, not everybody has an email address. And so they were assuming that all of the parents across the country were like their parents in California, and that they had email addresses, and that they knew their passwords, and that they could access them on something that wasn't a smartphone. And that was an extremely elitist thing of them to think. Because if you have schools that are in a lower income area, and or your parents don't speak English, you're not likely to be able to get them to sign into their email on a computer, type in everything that you ask them to, and manage their child's Apple ID, which is what was expected of them for Apple U13. So the first school that we tried this with was 40% Hispanic, and probably 20% of the parents didn't speak English. So my Spanish is terrible, but I can now ask in Spanish, did you get the email from Apple about your kid? Because I had to ask that question a lot with U13, and that was highly unpleasant and very time consuming, and it was really confusing for the parents. They didn't understand what it was for. They didn't understand why, and I got asked a lot, why can't you guys just make my child an Apple ID so I don't have to mess with this? And the answer was, Apple's lawyer said I can't. And we either had the choice of using U13 and not getting sued, or creating a whole bunch of illegal Apple IDs for kids under the age of 13. And I'd actually just finished creating all the illegal Apple IDs right before U13 came out. And so I had to burn all of those Apple IDs that had their valid email addresses attached to them and make new U13 accounts. Oh, and if the parents didn't answer that email, or they didn't get it, or you didn't have the right email address for them, that Apple ID was burned too. And you had to make another one with a number after it, or spell it slightly differently, or it was not a good way to do it. They had access to the App Store, but only to age-specific apps, and only free apps, and they couldn't do in-app purchases, and granted, that's a good thing, but the entire U13 process was bad. And I think there are memes for this. It was bad, and they should feel bad. It was not good. So this is the evolution of U13 after many, many meetings with Apple, some of which I was very grumpy in, because I think we were the second school district in the country to do U13. And so we ran into all of the things that were wrong with it before most people did, and we had to do it at scale because we had 2,000 sixth graders that had to have U13 IDs created for them, which is why they sent us paper, because I just told them I wasn't going to do that email thing again. I did a whole elementary school of email. I wasn't going to do that with sixth graders. That was a no. And then they had to sign in with this temporary password, and they had to set their own password, and they had to actually type the answers to their security questions correctly, which is really hard with sixth graders who can't type, and or parents who can't type, and or parents who can't type in English, and technicians who don't speak Spanish. So it was kind of a difficult thing. So Managed Apple ID solved that problem. Apple's lawyers are much happier with this, and I get many less grumpy emails from my SE about my usage of Apple's equipment and products. So class rostering, I already mentioned. Everybody's got an SIS if you're K-12. That's your student information system. A lot of people have PowerSchool or their SunGuard customers. They just came out with a PowerSchool plugin for Apple School Manager. I have yet to implement it. I am still on the SFTP because the PowerSchool plugin came out like a month and a half ago, and I didn't want to turn it on until after end of year processing, because everybody does end of year processing in the summer. It usually happens in June and it finishes in July 1, because that's when everybody's new school year starts. And so I just didn't want to turn it on before then, so I haven't done it yet. Because I didn't want to do it on July 4th week when nobody was there. That just sounds like a bad idea. So SFTP uploads have been around since last year. I don't know how many of you have dove into the Apple School Manager platform yet and tried to do these SFTP uploads. They can be difficult, just to say that kind of mildly. They don't ignore errors. If you have something that does not match, it will fail the whole upload. If you have a teacher that doesn't exist, or let's say you have a class that has a class ID that has a course ID but no instructor ID, the entire upload fails. If you have a student that's in a roster that doesn't actually exist with the teacher, the entire upload fails. If you have a student pointing to a roster that isn't tied to a class, the entire upload fails. The whole thing fails. And then you have to go through and count down all of these little errors and fix each individual error before you can re-upload it, and it will roster all of your classes. It is extremely time consuming. It took me a week to get my first SFTP upload to work because it had that many errors, because we've got 25,000 kids and close to 3,000 teachers. So we've got 13,000 something classes. It was very time consuming. Hopefully the PowerSchool plugin is better. I can't speak to how much better it is because I haven't tried it yet. So that's going to be something that we shall see how this goes. So there is, now that there's Apple Classroom 2, I think is what they've called it, with iOS 10.3, there are new features where you can make ad hoc classes. You don't actually have to have Apple School Manager. You can make ad hoc classes on the fly with your teachers. Those of you who are not K-12, I would recommend this option to you. Instead of messing with Apple School Manager, just get your professors to make ad hoc classes if you can get them to do it, because you won't be able to control a non-dep enrolled device anyway, and rostering is just going to be a huge waste of your time. So use the ad hoc classes. The students can turn off some of the features of Apple Classroom if you use ad hoc classes. Like they can say, nope, I don't want the teacher to view my screen. And you can't do anything about it because it isn't your device at that point. You can only do the lockdown features if it's a device that is dep enrolled and in your environment. So any questions about this particular section of the content? Wait, Catchbox. Nah. Okay, I'm gonna toss it to you and he can toss it to you.
The portion of creating the profiles on our MDM, can you speak to that?
I'm gonna go into that in the next section. So I'll cover that part. Much better throw than I could do.
It was great. Whenever you eventually migrate over, when you're going to try to stop doing SFTP, have you came up with a plan yet that you're going to try to switch over? Because I'm thinking about necessarily like replacing Apple IDs, and whether or not when I started doing it in Apple School Manager, it appended. I had first uploaded everything through spreadsheets, but then whenever I joined the SIS, it actually didn't merge. It appended them.
It duplicated your accounts, didn't it?
So you can't delete anything out of SIS necessarily without.
Correct. You can actually delete them from Apple School Manager now without waiting the 30 days. But if your kids are already using them, you're kind of trapped.
Okay.
Because I have the exact same problem. I have somewhere around 3,000 duplicated accounts in my Apple School Manager instance because I did the same thing. I did the CSV uploads originally for my kindergartners and my 6th graders because they were coming up from middle school, et cetera, and they were the first people that I needed in Apple School Manager because we needed those Apple IDs because I thought I needed to use them, which is not accurate. You don't need to use them. I'm not using them next year. No more. I'm just using them as placeholders for rostering. Yeah, I've got duplicate accounts. I don't think I can get rid of them. I think I'm just going to have to wait for those kids to graduate. Or, excuse me, or I'm going to need to wait for Apple to come up with a better solution for reintegrating those accounts. Because it didn't just duplicate them. It killed the person ID out of all of the CSV uploaded ones and then created duplicates that took their person IDs. Even though it was supposed to merge, it doesn't merge. It's not true. It doesn't happen. So I have the exact same problem as you, and I don't think there's a good solution. You're just going to have to go whenever you're rostering, because all the classes will be linked to the not duplicate IDs. And you will have to link the enrollment users to the not duplicate ones and let the kids use the The whole thing is kind of a mess.
Well, essentially you're just manually managing it again anyway, so it's really like...
Or just ignore them and pretend they don't exist. Because that's really what I'm doing. Because once the kids hit 13, they're going to start whining about wanting games. And unless you have a really nice superintendent that tells you that you can just block the App Store for all of your students, they're going to get real Apple IDs anyway. So you can, I figure once they get into 8th grade, I can delete all of those duplicates because I don't have to wait for them to graduate. I can wait for them to get to 8th grade, delete all their accounts, and they'll have real Apple IDs at that point anyway. So that is my plan. Anybody else have any questions about this section? Nope. Okay. So we're going to move on. Okay, so this is the how do I get it to work section, which is going to answer your question about connecting it back to your MDM and what could go wrong with it. There are lots of things. Not lots, some. So I talked to Apple yesterday. I had a meeting with them around 1 o'clock. And according to them, all of these things on this slide have been fixed. They asked me to remove this slide. I just decided to put a disclaimer on it because this was a thing. Apparently until 2 weeks ago. They said they fixed it literally 2 weeks ago. Some of these things day before yesterday. So I have not tested them yet. I can't vouch for them because I migrated into Apple School Manager last summer, not this summer. So call Apple support. It's going to be a pain if you try and do this yourself because apparently now you can migrate your VPP like program manager accounts. You can put them in with your Apple School Manager stuff. Personally, I have somewhere around 50 VPP accounts. I don't know how many you've got. If you got one, it's not a big deal. If you have a whole bunch that are subordinates to a program manager, you can migrate all the subordinates, or you could, but not the program manager. So at that point, it became a little pointless to move it all in there. Apparently now you can move all of them and then actually let people manage VPP apps through Apple School Manager and just make them content managers instead of people managers, et cetera, et cetera. So if you have people who want to be able to manage your VPP accounts, I have people that do that for me. I'm not a teacher. I don't know what's instructionally relevant. I shouldn't be forcing my own agenda on teachers who can decide what's instructionally relevant for their schools. We have digital learning coaches that decide for each school what apps are going to be in their catalog. And we do device-based VPP everything. So we don't deploy any public apps. We don't deploy any VPP user-based apps. They are all device-based in our environment because it's just neater and cleaner and nobody needs to remember their password. Which is also why you don't need to use these managed Apple IDs. If you do device-based VPP, these become irrelevant unless you're using them for rostering. So token renewal. I'm sure a lot of you guys already do this, and you will really only need to do it once a year, theoretically. But after you do your Apple School Manager migration, renew your token. It takes like 2 minutes. Excuse me, I have a bit of a cold. So renew your token. It's going to keep you from pulling your hair out going, why isn't this syncing? Sometimes you just have to renew the token. So this one is important because I screwed it up. I decided that I wanted to use my real email domain to make my managed Apple IDs because I was thinking that people were actually going to use them. So I was like, okay, I want to use my @lexington1.net. I want to use all of my real domain stuff so that people can just log into their managed Apple IDs and it'll be good. Well, what I didn't realize at the time was even the teacher IDs can't access the App Store. So using your real domain is a mistake because it takes the placeholder of a real Apple ID. And if you want your teachers and students to have a real Apple ID that associates back to their email account, this will completely hose their ability to do that. So I have thus far renamed somewhere around 15,000 Apple IDs to include my new subdomain because I use the regular domain and that was a terrible idea that my SE tried to talk me out of, and I did not listen because I am stubborn, and it ended poorly, and now I'm having to go through and manually rename them. And theoretically, they have a tool that'll do multiples at a time. It doesn't work. You have to do them one by one. Now, since they updated the GUI, you can only redo one at a time. They're like, no, you just select them all and you push the button. It doesn't work. I have a ticket in for this because it's not working. So please use a fake subdomain Personally, I like ASM because it's short. Apple's going to try and make you do appleid.domain.com or whatever. I like ASM because it's shorter than Apple ID and 6th graders can't type. It's really the long and short of it. So if you're a Google Apps domain, you can add fake subdomains as aliases to all of your email accounts. So if you want your kids to be able to use these managed Apple IDs for iCloud storage, because they do iCloud storage, so if you've got under 13-year-old kids and you want them to be able to back their stuff up to iCloud, this is a good option. And if you want to be able to email them a link to set their own passwords, because you can't set them for them, or at least you couldn't until maybe 2 weeks ago, you can just add an alias to your whole domain and have everybody have an alias that's blah, 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 at asm dot whatever your domain is .org, which is what we did. So that was how we got around being able to email stuff out, is we just made an alias for everything. So like I've said, you don't have to make them use this. So if you're not using, there is a caveat. If you're using shared mode, if you are fancy and you've gotten new Apple or new iPads in the last year or so that actually have enough space and the capability to use that shared mode whenever you enroll them, you do have to use the Apple IDs and the kids do have to know how to log into them. So I bought all of our new stuff in 2015, and at the time 16 gig iPads were still an option. So we bought 16 gig iPads. Well, those are too small to use with the shared use mode, which kind of stinks. And we have a lot of Apple iPad 2s still in our elementary schools, so we wouldn't be able to use those anyway. So we don't use the one-to-one, we don't use the shared use. All of our iPads are set up dedicated. So if you want to use the shared use, you actually still have to use these Apple IDs because the kids have to use them to log in. Still though, App Store, use them for rostering. SFTP upload. So like I said, if you don't have everything matching, it will break. And it will break. And it will break. And it will break. Mine still breaks almost every day. So, and I've been doing it for a year. I had like a 3-month time period where nothing changed in our SIS, and it worked, and it was great. And then I looked back, and it was like, hasn't updated in such and such many hours, and it was orange. And I was like, no, because I had to go back through and figure out where it broke. They assigned a class to a guidance counselor. Is where it broke, is because she wasn't a real teacher. And so her being assigned a class that has a class ID, that has a course ID, that has students rostered to it, broke all of those kids' rosters, that class ID. And she wasn't a real teacher, so she was being filtered out of my export from PowerSchool. So that particular school likes to break my upload on a regular basis because they like to assign classes to people who aren't real teachers. They'll assign them to secretaries and guidance counselors and dance instructors and gym teachers and things. So I filter out gym teachers too because I don't want gym people using iPads in gym. So they are mad about that. I've told them it just doesn't work. But they want to use iPads in gym and I don't want them to because basketballs and iPads don't mix, in my opinion. And hardwood floors. Basketballs, iPads, and hardwood floors just seem like a recipe to break iPads. Okay, so here's the link to your MDM part. So I have AirWatch. We've got AirWatch in the room right now, calling you guys out just a little bit. They worked with me really well. So try working with your vendor. I'm not sure how it works with Jamf. I think there are a lot of Jamf customers here at this conference. In AirWatch, you have to link those managed Apple IDs to the enrollment user IDs. I have a lot of managed Apple IDs, so that whole putting them in a CSV file and uploading them never actually worked for me because I have too many of them. I went into the database and tied them together. And AirWatch was kind enough to give me a script that added a push command into the device queue to push out all those profiles to my iPads. So I use that on a pretty regular basis. They have a very kind DBA named Dennis, who helps me out whenever I break my database, which isn't that often anymore. I haven't had a ticket in 6 months, according to my TAM. So, well, fingers crossed on that one. But I had to create custom database stuff to be able to link all of my enrollment user IDs back to my managed Apple IDs, because you have to filter out the fake ones that are duplicates with no classes, because if you tie those to your kids, it won't push the profile because there's no class information associated with it. So you can't attach a non-class associated Apple ID with an enrollment user ID and expect the profile to get pushed out by your MDM. It won't work. So if you're trying to test it before you actually roster your classes, you're going to get really frustrated. The other thing is you have to host those pictures somewhere where your MDM and the iPads can see them. So if you actually want your kids to have faces in Apple School Manager, I hope you have an IIS server handy, or some kind of web server that you can dump that data onto. Because you also have to put that picture URL into your assignment information before you push out all those profiles to your teachers, because those only go to the teacher. The kid profiles don't care, because they don't care what the children look like. Only the teacher profiles get those pictures. So you have to have them in there before you push the teacher profile, or they won't get the pictures. It won't update if you update the pictures unless you go through and you either unassign this teacher enrollment user ID and reassign it, or use Dennis's handy script to push out new versions of the profiles, because we update those pictures every year, and it's either unassign all of my teachers and reassign them, which I'm just not going to do, or add that content into the device management queue, or the device, there's a name for it, it's long, into that task queue to push out fresh copies of that profile to all of my teacher machines so that they get those updated pictures. Because you'd be surprised if they get one picture of one kid, they want pictures of all the kids because they're teachers. And it's really easy for them to just glance, provided that you have up-to-date pictures. So use the ones from the yearbook people, don't use the ones from PowerSchool. Because the PowerSchool ones don't necessarily get updated on a regular basis, depending on who your PowerSchool people are, or your SIS people. So questions about this section? Bueller? No? Okay. So here's the fun part. Into the classroom. So this is the part that I really enjoyed. And you will hear much wailing and gnashing of teeth from your students when you roll this out. But the first thing that you have to do is find people that are competent to train teachers. So I see you laughing. It's an interesting problem. So we are lucky enough to have people called digital learning coaches. They used to be teachers that decided to leave the classroom to be teachers for technology stuff. So they teach our teachers how to integrate new stuff into their classrooms, which is very handy for me because I can depend on them to do that, and they're really good at working with me. If you are not lucky enough to have people like this, you're going to have to find tech-savvy teachers and or some magical friendly technician that is patient enough to teach teachers how to do this. I don't know if you have those kind of magical friendly technicians. Anybody? No? You don't have social skills in your IT department?
I am the social skills.
So I don't have any social skills in my IT department either, unless you count me, and that's stretching it. So train your trainers. They'll enjoy it. I highly suggest using a sample class. Don't just tell them what it can do. Make them students in an Apple Classroom class and control their iPads from your demo, because they're going to not get it unless you demonstrate it to them. And they will then show you creatively how to break it. One of the favorite ways to break it is to turn on airplane mode, because it disables the Bluetooth in iOS 10 and below. According to Apple, who didn't make me sign an NDA this time, so you will not hear this is covered by the NDA under this agreement, in iOS 11, they are not turning off the Bluetooth in airplane mode. So that will cease to be an issue in iOS 11. And if you push out that Bluetooth restriction, provided that you can get them to turn on the Bluetooth first, which is a giant pain, you can prevent them from turning off the Bluetooth after that, which will be very helpful for the functioning of your Apple Classroom, because children will try and break it. That's really the long and short of it. If they turn their iPads off, it removes the lock. If they turn the Bluetooth off, it removes any locks on their device. If they turn off their Wi-Fi, it removes any locks on their device. So they will try and break it, but the same kids that you have discipline issues with now, you will continue to have discipline issues with Apple Classroom. And that's something that's really important to differentiate to your teachers, is this is not a discipline tool. Excuse me. This is a classroom direction tool. This is something to give your teachers more information about their students. This is not something that they're going to be able to use to discipline unruly children, because those unruly children will continue to misbehave regardless of what you do to their devices. Classroom management, this isn't it. This is good teachers with good classroom management will still have good classroom management with Apple Classroom. Teachers who have bad classroom management will still have bad classroom management with Apple Classroom, because children will be children and the front parts of their brains aren't fully developed yet, and they will continue to try and break things because that is what children do. So it's unfair to expect them to do otherwise, because they just won't. So I actually have a presentation that you guys are welcome to use. That is how I train my trainers. So the primary difference between the train the trainers presentation and the train the teachers presentation is that I remove how it works. Teachers don't care how it works. They really don't. It's pointless to them, and they will stop paying attention to you if you try and explain how all of these things connect together. And it's not relevant information for them anyway. So it's a cute little presentation. What is it? It looks like paper. It's fun. This is the piece that explains how it works. We're an AirWatch customer, so I include AirWatch. It's a pretty good description. I've got a chart if you want to explain it to your technicians. I have a flow chart. It's a big flow chart. You might not want it. So Teacher Tools was the previous thing. I don't know if any of you were AirWatch customers that use Teacher Tools. It was great unless the kids walked out of the classroom with their iPads still locked in, and then you had to wipe them. So why it's better, probably not relevant to you. Feel free to remove that slide if you copy this into your Google Drive. So what can it do? It's got a quick listing of all the things that Apple Classroom is capable of. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with it yet, but this might be good information for you. They can view student device screens, which is awesome. I think that's probably the favorite feature of Apple Classroom for everybody, because our previous superintendent told our teachers 3 years ago that we were going to have something that was basically AB Tutor for iPads, and it didn't exist at the time. And we were really freaked out that she told everybody that, because I was like, no, because it wasn't a thing. We couldn't see iPad screens. We could lock them, ish, but we couldn't do that. That wasn't a thing at the time. Apple Classroom solved that problem for us before people started really asking too many questions about, well, where's our screen viewing capability on our iPads? Because we really like that in AB Tutor. Why can't we do that on iPads? Because Apple was always the response. Because privacy and Apple and lawyers and Apple and lawyers. And so the viewing the screens thing is their favorite thing, because they can tell if their kids are wandering off task. So that's one of the biggest things. Or they can share student work up to their projector or their TV or whatever. You don't actually have to have an Apple TV to use that whole sharing their work thing. For the most part, our teachers don't use the project to Apple TV function. They just pull up the student screen on their device that's already displaying to the projector. So that whole push it to the Apple TV feature, it's nice, but it's not necessary. You can just pull up their screen on the teacher device without having to try and connect a student device to the Apple TV. If you have Apple TVs, we have somewhere around 600 of them. So we just started enrolling them in our MDM. That's been fun. So they can do dynamic student grouping. This is important if you have blended learning. So how many people in here have schools that do blended learning? one besides me. So blended learning has small groups. Basically, it's a flipped classroom model. So the teacher is not standing in front like I'm doing right now, lecturing at you. I would be closer to the back of the classroom, and you guys would all be working on individual little projects in small groups using your integrated technology to do so, rather than just sitting there listening and possibly taking notes or zoning out or playing on your cell phone. So that they can either launch the apps or lock them into the apps. So those are both good features that serve two very different purposes. If you just want to direct traffic, you can just launch the app. If you want to make sure that they're staying on task, you can lock them in. You can also AirPlay them to the Apple TV, like I said. You can navigate to content on Safari. You can't keep them in that content on Safari. But if you're paying attention to the little screen thumbnails, you can tell if they're meandering off to something else. Typically, I plant somebody in my audience that will navigate to looking at something that's completely unrelated, like bears. Bears is my favorite thing to have them Google, and they just scroll through a whole bunch of pictures of bears. And so I'll pull them up on the projector and I'll say, see, Johnny here is Googling bears. This is not part of our assignment. He needs to get back to what he was supposed to be doing. Johnny, stop that. I'm going to lock you out of Safari now. And so they can really have more granular understanding of the flow of their lessons if they pay attention to those little thumbnails and what the kids are doing at any given time. It really just gives them a better visibility to their students versus controlling, like crazy controlling their classroom. So then I go through a demo. As you can see, all of our kids have faces because I imported all of our pictures and they're cute little faces. So what can go wrong with Apple Classroom? You can have the education profile not there. So one of the biggest problems that we ran into was 6th graders who were duplicate accounts that didn't actually have classes associated with them that I accidentally associated the enrollment user ID with. That was probably the biggest issue that we ran into. Because if you associate an enrollment user with an Apple ID that does not have classes associated with them, it will not push the education profile. Say that again. If they don't have classes, it doesn't push the profile. The teacher can't see them. They will be listed as offline in perpetuity until that gets fixed. So always pay attention to how many classes are associated with that Apple ID before you assign an enrollment user ID to it, or you'll get very frustrated. I did. I figured it out, but I was very frustrated. So the fix for that is just assigning the correct enrollment user ID to the correct Apple ID. And then it'll push down that profile. We call our junior AirWatch admins JAWs. So everyone just calls them sharks, which is a little counterintuitive. But if you see me say shark in any kind of presentation that I've shared with you, I mean AirWatch admin. Those are my little sharks. They are my subordinate AirWatch admins. So the other problem, if the device isn't responding to commands, it's listed as offline, and it does have the education profile, it's probably some kind of shenanigans. So there are a couple different reasons why it could be having shenanigans. A, it could be on iOS 9.2, and it isn't up to date enough to run Apple Classroom. That's one main shenanigan that I've noticed. We sent out a really super aggressive compliance policy that basically disabled all of the student iPads that weren't up to iOS 10 and solved that issue. So if your district is friendly enough to let you pretty much disable and break any iPad that doesn't meet your requirements, it's an easy way to make them update their stuff. Just don't forget that don't do single app mode, just do like the blacklisting of apps, or rather whitelisting of apps, and just whitelist settings and pictures so they can delete crap out of their device if they don't have enough space to download the iOS update, because that's a pretty common problem, is if you just lock them down to settings only, they won't be able to clean up their iPad unless they're just deleting apps. So you always have to give them access to that picture roll to be able to clean out their pictures to free up space. I learned that the hard way. I locked down a whole high school of kids, and they were like, well, we don't have enough space to download the thing, because they had like 10 gigs of video sitting in their camera roll and like 4 gigs of classroom data and then no space to download the update. So you have to give them access to pictures. Learned that the hard way. The other thing is Bluetooth disabled. So like I was talking about before, there's a new restriction option in iOS 10 that you can restrict changes to their Bluetooth settings. This is helpful-ish because you actually have to get them to turn on the Bluetooth before you push out the restriction. And depending on how large your schools are, I have high schools that have 2,000 kids in them. You have to get them to do it all at the same time for any kind of a group of them that you want to deploy this to. So you could do it by grade level. I did whole schools. And so they just literally had an announcement. They told their teachers ahead of time. They had an announcement like 2 p.m. Okay, everybody, walk around the classroom, make sure all your kids turn on their Bluetooth. And then I pushed out the restriction so that everything was on. And then we ran into another problem. Special ed and assistive technology. So if you have students who are hearing impaired and they like to pair their iPads with their hearing aids, this restriction is bad because it will keep them from pairing things with their hearing aids, and you'll have to exempt them from that restriction. I shared that feedback with Apple yesterday, and they are typically very responsive when it comes to accessibility, and they were very surprised to hear that that was the situation. I also mentioned blind children who need to connect Braille displays to their devices. It will also break that. So any kind of assistive technology that is Bluetooth connected to a student's device, whether it's a keyboard because they have issues with motor control, or a hearing aid, or a Braille reader, that restriction will break it. And then they will be coming to your help desk trying to explain to your help desk person, hey, I can't change this, and they'll have to be exempted from that restriction. And they will just have to be trustworthy children because you will not be able to apply that to them. So hopefully Apple will adjust that. Fingers crossed they listen. Sometimes they do. They've implemented several restrictions that I've asked for. So like the getting rid of Find My Friends, that was a big one. That was a big one for us. So, because non-custodial parents being able to find their children that they're not actually allowed to talk to because they're child molesters is really a problem. And Apple didn't consider that before they pushed out that feature and made it part of the operating system. It was like, hey, can you turn this off? Because child molesters. And they responded to that pretty fast. So if you give them a good reason and you make yourself annoying enough, they typically will respond. I am very annoying, I'm sure, to them. And I'm sure that they do not enjoy it. So what I asked for, and you guys can tag yourselves on this feature request if you would like, is to change it so that it just forces the Bluetooth to be on, but doesn't disable their ability to pair devices. Because that would solve all of my problems, and probably all of everyone else's problems. So I think that's a very good feature request, personally. You also have to make sure they're not on the wrong Wi-Fi. So I don't know if you guys have a visitor Wi-Fi that is segregated from your regular network that kids like to connect their cell phones to. Sometimes they will connect their iPads to that. And there's no restrictions profile for blacklisting wireless networks. So you got to make sure that they're connected to the correct Wi-Fi, because if they can't talk to the teacher device over Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, Apple Classroom does not work. So that's the long and short of that one. Yeah. Can you throw him the catch box, Naveen?
So what we did to get around the guest network is we add it as a profile on their iPad with the wrong password.
Yeah, that works if it has a password.
Yeah, ours does.
Ours doesn't.
Ours is actually in the SSID. Guest W is Falcon, so that because makes it easier.
Okay.
But we pushed it to the iPads with the wrong password.
We asked our superintendent if we could password protect that wireless network, and she said no. Because that would make it difficult
Yes, yeah.
for people to connect to things. Oh no. So we are not allowed to password protect that network, therefore it is a problem for us with that. And with iOS 10.3, by the way, if they connect to that wireless network and they're signed into their Apple ID on their personal device, it'll sync that wireless network over to any other machine that they are logged into with that Apple ID. if they have iCloud enabled. So if you have a whole lab of Macs and you're wondering why they're having issues, and you've got kids logged into their iCloud accounts on those Macs, it's because they've been connecting to your guest network. And it's really annoying. So that's my thing there. If all of the stuff that should be there is there, it's probably not on the right version of iOS. We had that problem a good bit. Honestly, I have that problem more with teachers than anybody else. Teachers not updating their devices. So that is the end of my trainer-facing thing. If you want to use this, just copy it into your Google Drive and get rid of that whole how does it work slide. Because nobody likes that slide. No one pays attention to it. It's a bad slide. I like it. It's good for technicians. It's terrible for teachers of any kind. Let's back to my regular presentation. Okay, so that's my spiel on finding people who can train teachers how to use Classroom, because that's really important. It's being able to find people that can train people. You have to find people that can speak. You have to find people that are nice. You have to find people who are patient, because people will ask a lot of questions. So if it's somebody who is not patient, they are the wrong choice. They have to genuinely want to be helpful. So the other thing that I learned was don't enable those teacher education profiles until after they've been trained. I made a Google form for our trainers to submit names to have their functionality enabled. Because if you enable everybody before you train them, it will spread like wildfire. Those teachers will talk to their friends, and their friends will download the app, and they will start using it without being trained. So if you make it so that they have to be trained to get access to the functionality, they will all jump on being trained instead of trying to use it on their own without being trained. So I highly recommend that staggered rollout. It worked really well for me. I had a full implementation within a month and a half. So, and that was about 1,200 teachers. So it works well. Doing them in subject areas for training also works really well. But yeah, teachers hear about cool stuff. They will try and use said cool stuff before you train them on said cool stuff. So Apple Classroom is very cool stuff. They want it. They will ask. So then you got to roll that education configuration profile to your students. I did it to all my students at once. I only staggered the teachers. So it's easier to just have everything there. New students that enroll, you got to go back and associate that profile with them. There are ways to automate this, but they're typically back-end like database ways. So sometimes it's just easier to give that functionality to your technicians and make them do it for their sites. I am very lucky in that I have a dedicated technician at each high school and middle school. And those people have delegated administrative access to their locations in my MDM. So if you do not have people like that, this might get a little time consuming, at least at first, especially around the start of school. Here are the most common ways that kids break these. I've already kind of gone over this, so you guys already know. Parents really like Apple Classroom. And the reason why they like it is because most of them assume that iPads are just toys. They assume that they are not educational devices. They assume that they do not assist the students in learning. Granted, that depends on the philosophy of your district and how your teachers implement that technology in their classroom. In my district, we heavily utilize our devices, like really heavily utilize our devices. Our MDM is super beefy because it needed to be, because we use it all the time. And iPads get a really bad rap because we rolled out our one-to-one implementation in 2011 before a lot of the current restrictions were available. Before really any restrictions were available, it was like you had to run everything through configurator, and if the kid wiped the device, they could just remove themselves from management. There was no DEP. It was terrible. 2014, DEP came around. I broke my entire mobile iron installation, and then we switched over to AirWatch. So the parents really like it. I've had parents who wanted to say, no, I don't want my child to have an iPad. They were going to actively refuse for their child to have an iPad. And they were won over by the fact that those teachers could see what the children were doing in their classroom. It is a huge selling point for parents because it makes them feel like they're not just having their kids wasting time in class emailing their friends, which they will do. And they will put emojis in their signatures that are like this long. And I don't understand why they do it. And I really wish Apple would include a don't do signatures restriction. Because we have kids that are like, so-and-so is my bae, blah, 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 in their signatures. And it's seriously like this long. You're just like, why? Why do you want this? And they're just like, I just do. Because they're children. And children do silly things. So Apple Classroom, really good for parents. Also, it makes them feel better about email. Because a lot of the kids, they just email. Because we don't actually allow our kids access to any kind of chatting functionality. If we find out that something has chat in it, we block it. It gets disabled on a pretty regular basis, and we actually hide it. I have 3 profiles that hide about 400 apps. And there was much wailing and gnashing of teeth whenever the hiding functionality came out because they're like, no, my VPN is gone. Sorry, broken. And they think I'm the devil. So they don't actually know who I am, but they leave nasty comments in my my app catalog under the reviews for the AirWatch agent, comparing me to Skynet. They like to compare me to Skynet. They ask, why does the AirWatch me? That one is a favorite. They think I'm cancer. I've been called cancer a couple times. Literal cancer, I liked, was my favorite. There's some interesting reviews from those kids. But there's a lot of things that you can do to make your iPads a lot more parent-friendly. And this is one of those things that you can do to make people assume that you are not just wildly wasting taxpayer money. Because that is a huge thing. Parents will assume, because it is a cool new toy, you are wildly wasting taxpayer money. And this is not the case if it is implemented properly. So, just 1 second. There you go. So if you will pass him the catch box, please.
You ever invite or have the parents to see how the devices are working?
We have wanted to do that.
Because we're deciding if we should do that.
Do that.
What you said you...
I want to.
Right.
I haven't been able to nail down my communications people because she's like the most busy person on the planet. And it's really hard to plan things more than a year out. So I have to basically grab her the previous summer if I want to do anything by the next summer. So I did not get to do that. If you have the opportunity, do that. And if you want to know more about good community outreach, check out Mooresville School District in North Carolina. They're really, really good at community outreach.
North or South Carolina?
North Carolina. They're a small district. They have maybe 6,000 kids. I think they've got 4 or 5 schools. It's little. But all their kids have MacBooks. And they had community buy-in for that before they ever rolled it out. They're a little snobby, but they have good information. And they can really help about that community outreach part because that was really important for them, for their taxpayer base, to not assume that they were wildly wasting taxpayer money. So if you have the opportunity to do that community outreach, do it. It's great. We've got another question over here if you will throw him the box. And the rest of this is questions. So if you guys have questions about this or about anything else, please ask me. I like questions.
So to follow up on what you said, the most parent communication you can do, you can never do enough of it. So I highly recommend it.
Yes.
One of the things that we're dealing with, so we're an independent school, we're much smaller. Every student that we have has actually a MacBook Pro. And they're all admins on their own machines. We've been doing it for over just about 10 years. So
so you
we're
had
well
to.
established with
Okay.
this.
You can't change it now.
I would never want to change it.
Okay.
The one question that I actually have with regard to Apple School Manager is, and I apologize because I did have to step out a couple times.
Oh, you're fine.
device naming. Is there any way in which you can enforce device naming?
I mean, I do, but that's through my MDM. It's not through Apple School Manager.
Okay, that's what I was curious about. We're using Jamf, so I mean we're trying to figure out some things around that.
Sometimes
because
getting the AirDrop name to change is hard.
it's not so much the AirDrop. It's
You just care about
simply
the device name
the
itself?
device name, because then we tie a lot of that back to things we see on the back end, so we don't see MAC addresses or IP addresses.
Yeah.
It's tied to DNS, and it goes back to a lot of other things.
I can see all
So-
3 of those things in AirWatch pretty easily. So
Okay.
I force device name to be the serial number.
Oh no, we force device name, like mine is like MS William Stites. It's the actual name of the person, so you can see all of it.
We have too many people for that.
Right.
And if I put them into Active Directory that way, it makes them hard to find because all of our Macs are AD joined.
You're doing sleep.
So most of our Macs belong to teachers. Our kids don't have Macs; they have iPads.
Right.
I do force name their iPads
Okay.
with their names so that we can see
And
them when
that's
they
through
pop up in the
AirWatch.
wireless controller.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's
Yes.
a lot of it. Yep.
'Cause we
But
do-
that's through AirWatch. That's not through anything that you've been able to do through.
No, it's not an Apple School Manager. That is an AirWatch function.
But is that something that can be locked on through
In
Apple
AirWatch?
School? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yes.
Right, yeah. Okay.
No.
Yes. Gotcha.
Any other questions? It doesn't have to be Apple School Manager related. You can ask me whatever. We have 19 minutes.
I just wanted to clarify the MDM restriction. Is that preventing Bluetooth from being disabled? Is that what you're talking about?
You're talking about the Bluetooth restriction through MDM.
Yeah.
So it's a regular old restriction in a restrictions profile that just prevents them from changing it.
To
So if
off.
it's off, they can't turn it on. If it's on, they can't turn it off.
But it has to be on for Apple Classroom, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Which
And
is what makes it a pain.
Okay. And that's why you had to tell them all to turn it on so you could push that. Okay. And the other thing was enabling that restriction. You said that breaks pairing with like
Anything.
what's that?
Anything. It breaks pairing with anything.
Forcing Bluetooth to remain on. Oh, okay.
Forcing or restricting changes to the Bluetooth
Oh, okay.
breaks it because it's not forcing it on, which is what I want it to be. It is preventing changes to
Changes,
Bluetooth
okay.
settings, which then prevents any changes to pairing things with Bluetooth.
Which is why you wanted Apple to look into allowing pairing.
Yes.
Okay.
Because it really hampers our ability to mass assign things without making exemptions for assistive technology students with 504 accommodations. Anybody else? Any questions? Okay.
Okay, so what is the minimal that I have to do to Apple School Manager? Every time I log into DEP or VPP, it says, you need to go to Apple School Manager. I don't really want to go to Apple School Manager because I work at a small private school and we do it all kind of in-house.
Okay.
And am I going to be forced into doing any of this, or can I just stay with the model of MDM pushing apps to...
You can stay with the model of MDM pushing apps. I don't manage apps through Apple School Manager right
Okay.
now
Okay,
at all.
that's what I was checking. Okay.
I use it for managed Apple IDs and class rostering.
Yeah,
That's all I use it for.
we don't do any of that, so...
You want to know if we get rid of that knowing thing every time you log in?
Well, that and was I gonna eventually have to do this? Because I don't, like I said, we really don't want to do that. We just want to keep it simple for the kids because we've got preschool kids, and
We also have preschool kids.
Yeah, well, I was in a big district much like yours before
yeah.
I went private school. That's why I've been shaking my head at all of your stuff, because in Hampton City Schools, where I was previously at, we did the same exact thing that you were in. We actually forced Apple to send us spreadsheets of Apple IDs before.
How did you manage to get them to do that?
Our director of technology hounded them.
Because I'm mean,
Yeah,
and I didn't succeed.
Yeah, he succeeded. We literally got this huge spreadsheet of Apple IDs for 20-some thousand kids, and
Wow.
that's how we did it before this came out.
So what was the name of that district so that I can use that for leverage?
Hampton City Schools.
Okay. Because I,
Yeah,
cause I am not above using other people's stuff for leverage. But yeah, you don't have to manage apps that way. I still go to deploy or volume.itunes.apple.com to get VPP licenses for things, and then I sync them back to AirWatch, and then we deploy them through our app catalog. Yep. Anybody else?
Sort of to switch it up a little bit. First off, Apple alluded yesterday a little bit that they were going to be working VPP and DEP into Apple School Manager as the only way to go about it. So that's
DEP is already in Apple School Manager.
Yes.
Is the only way to go about it.
So they.
Yes.
Yes. But I was actually going to ask you just a question about filtering. You guys seem to be pretty locked down. So you do.
We do.
Do you guys use the app model for that, or do you guys have people coming?
We proxy them back through our network with a squid proxy. So we use Smoothwall for our filtering. So we have a pack file that we publish to the internet, and we have it set to fail closed. So if they can't reach the pack file, they get no internet, which really frustrates them when we do server maintenance, because we reboot those servers and the kids are like, no. But we warn them via email, which they don't read, before we send that out. So then I send push notifications to them. Hey, you're not going to have any internet during this and this time. Please be patient. It won't take that long. So we push a pack file down to them through global proxy, and we proxy all of their traffic back through our network to make sure that they're filtered at home. Maybe. I am not really super emoji literate. I have like 3 that I use in text messaging. I have started putting smiley faces in my emails to make people assume that I'm not being mean. Because it's really hard to include emotional nuances in email. So it's just like, no, that was totally the wrong way to do it, smiley face. And then it becomes immediately less grumpy, which works out nicely for me. So anybody else have any questions? Doesn't have to be Apple School Manager related. We have 14 minutes. Okay. Can you throw him the catch box, please?
Processing.
Has anyone used Apple School Manager for monitoring viewing iPads across subnets?
I mean, we use iPads across subnets pretty regularly.
So, for example, are your teachers on one subnet and your students on another?
Yes.
And you have no problem with the teachers being able to see the students and vice? Okay. All right. Must be a configuration issue I have somewhere.
Do you... We do have a Bonjour gateway, but
Yep.
it's not using Bonjour to do that traffic.
Yeah.
So we only keep the Bonjour gateway on for Apple TV connectivity with iPad 2s.
Yep.
Because Bonjour doesn't traverse subnets. So I don't think that it's Bonjour traffic, because we turned it off forgetting that we had iPad 2s last semester. And had to turn it back on again 3 days later when the elementary schools were like, we can't connect to our Apple TVs. And it didn't negatively impact Apple School Manager or Apple Classroom.
Okay.
So they have to be in range for Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. That's the biggest thing. Is what's really nice about Apple Classroom is the kids can't get stuck, which is really great, because previous things that we used to manage them, they would get stuck, and then we would have to wipe their iPads.
I have a Ethernet rig in my office for iPads just to get them back on.
I have that too, but it doesn't work for iPad 2s.
Oh.
Yeah. So that only works for things with a lightning port. So I wiped a lot of iPad 2s previously.
It's like the Wild
with our
West days
previous.
of iPads.
Hmm?
It's like the Wild West days of iPads.
It is. It feels like the dark ages when I have to plug in iPad 2s. But yeah, it's fine. It's nice that it doesn't go through walls, because if the kid walks out of the classroom, they'll get unlocked. It's about 50 feet if it's open air. It's directly outside of the classroom if it's cinder block. So if it's glass, it goes a little farther. It really depends on what your buildings are made out of. Most of ours are basically Faraday cages covered in concrete. So we've got a lot of steel and a lot of concrete and a lot of rebar and a lot of glass Our previous superintendent was very much of the mind of it costs the same to build a beautiful school as it does to build an ugly one. So we have a lot of very pretty schools that were built during her tenure as our superintendent, but none of them have good cell service. So, any other questions? Anybody? Nope. Well, it looks like we're going to finish about 10 minutes early. We seem to have just popped into the orange of my timer back there. So I appreciate you guys coming. Hopefully this was helpful to you. Shoot me an email if you need me. My information's in the presentation. And oh wait, do we have one more question?
Is that PowerPoint saved or shared in the drive?
It is. If you open the master list of all of those notes and you navigate to the Google Doc for this presentation, I actually put it in there before I started. So you guys have access to that. And it also links back to that trainer-facing presentation for Apple Classroom training. So you guys are also welcome to steal that. So let me know if you need anything. Yes?
I just wanted to make a comment, if that's okay. So
Sure.
I apologize too, because you mentioned Mooresville, and we went one-to-one, and I know there's probably people who are thinking about it or going into it here in this room. The big thing, we all went and visited Mooresville and watched.
I
what
did
they
too.
But the demographic of Mooresville, we were going once, it was a lot different than our demographic. So a lot of what they were doing restriction-wise, a lot of how they had set things up, we came back and our administrators and our teachers were like, well, this is what Mooresville's doing, so this is what we're going to do. We're going to have this rollout. We're going to do this. But our demographic was so different that it really allowed us to be a lot more flexible than Mooresville, and we were going for something different. They had poor test scores, and their test scores got good. So we already had really high test scores, so what were we doing the one-to-one for? So even the education people working with technology need to be involved in that process to say, why are we doing this?
That speaks to communication. One of the biggest things we did when we rolled out our program was we laid out what our educational goals and guidelines were. And everything that we do from the back end, from an IT structure, is in support of those educational goals. So when I said that every kid is an admin on their own machine, that was derived specifically from our educational goals that we had in the teaching and learning environment that we wanted for our school. Again, independent school, we're at 1,000 students pre-K through 12.
This-
So we are a much, but that's what when we looked at our one-to-one, I went to schools and learned as much from schools that were doing things poorly as well as schools that are doing things well, and then came back and we had those conversations. We'd have a conversation over what apps we were going to use. We'd have a conversation of what did we want teaching and learning to look like in the classroom, and then from that, what we wanted to look like, then we started looking at, okay, we're going to go with a laptop versus an iPad. We're going to go with this app versus that app. We're going to go with this case versus that case, because we tested all of that stuff. And it took us years, not months, years to deploy. But when we did, day one, we launched with Evernote. 2 months into our program, we had Evernote in our school filming a promotional video for how to implement Evernote in schools, and we've been doing it for 2 months.
You don't have to implement that slowly. We did our last we did our last device refresh in 6 days.
The refresh is one thing.
Yeah.
A rollout from not having a program
Yeah.
to having a program.
It is better to do that slowly.
Professional development, communications.
But it's really funny
Yeah.
because it just brings up a point, and I think that you saw it in your presentation too, is that you as a technician, you shouldn't be deciding what apps go on.
Mm-mm.
It's up to the teachers. But
Nope.
at the same time, you are the go-between between the technology and what they're trying to do. You understand the technology.
We actually came to your school.
Right. Well, we have two separate departments. We have instructional technology and
Alan
we have
Stevenson.
information technology. And our instructional technology department and our information technology department work really closely together. We have a weekly meeting with them that includes our CIO, our network coordinator, the application support coordinator, and me. Because I am basically the go-between for all of the mobile device stuff, because that is most of what I do is mobile device stuff. I don't do very many things that don't involve either a MacBook or an iPad. So, or I do some database stuff, but that's about it. Anybody else? Any other comments, questions, thoughts? Anybody? Okay. Well, thank you guys. Thanks, everybody.